Frozen fields, fragile lives, the first breath of winter in medieval Europe often arrived without ceremony, carried on a creeping chill that stiffened the soil and set a pale frost across the thatched rooftops. For peasants, these seasonal shifts were not quaint markers of time, but grim warnings. The fields that had sustained them through summer and autumn were suddenly locked beneath a frozen crust. The grain they had laboured over, the hay stacked for their animals, and the dwindling vegetables in their small plots, all were now the thin buffer standing between their families and starvation. The great historian Mark Bloch once described the medieval peasant as living in permanent danger of hunger. In winter, this danger was magnified. Unlike the lords and clergy, who might feast on venison in castle halls, peasants stared into larders that too often resembled little more than shadowy corners with a few sacks of barley or rye. Even the wealthier serfs, who had managed to keep a pig or a goat, knew that one harsh frost or an outbreak of animal disease could erase their meagre reserves in an instant. And yet the medieval village endured. Every winter, ordinary families tested their limits, balancing between resilience and despair. Some chronicles describe winters so brutal that entire communities fled, seeking milder climates or the charity of monasteries. In 1315, during the onset of the Great Famine, villagers across northern Europe reported fields so sodden and then frozen that no crops could be saved. Mothers boiled weeds to feed their children, while fathers scavenged bark from trees to grind into an unappetizing but filling bread. Alongside these facts sits a stranger, more human dimension. Folk tales whispered of hungry January, a spirit said to steal food from households that failed to give proper offerings to the poor. Some scholars suspect these stories were less about superstition and more about reinforcing community responsibility, reminding families that hoarding too tightly could curse them with isolation when they most needed their neighbours. Still, we cannot be certain. Scholars still debate whether such tales were shared in earnest belief, or if they were moral allegories layered onto the oral traditions that trickled down through generations. Imagine, then, the first nights of December in a peasant hut. The wind slips through every gap in the walls of wattle and daub. Smoke from the central hearth curls into the air, sometimes escaping through a hole in the roof, sometimes lingering thickly inside. Children huddle together on straw pallets, wrapped in wool scraps. Outside, the village seems to fall silent, save for the occasional bark of a dog or the crunch of snow beneath the boots of a watchman pacing the edge of the fields. Winter was not merely cold, it was isolating. Days shortened, work slowed, and a sense of foreboding seeped into the very rhythm of life. This fragility also bred remarkable resilience. The peasants knew the pattern of the seasons intimately, and their strategies, though rudimentary, had been honed over centuries. Their survival would hinge on a delicate choreography of rationing, shared labour, and sheer endurance. Every decision mattered, whether to slaughter a pig early to save grain, or wait in hopes that the animal could breed another year, whether to burn precious firewood now for comfort, or save it for the true depths of January, when frostbite threatened fingers and toes. It is within this fragile world, teetering between scarcity and survival, that our story unfolds. From hidden cellars to fireside rituals, from desperate diets to ingenious household tricks, the medieval peasant faced the winter with methods that shock us today for both their ingenuity and their harshness. Stockpiles, cellars. Beneath the surface of medieval villages, survival often depended on what lay hidden underground. In a world without refrigeration, peasants turned to root cellars and storage pits, dark, cool spaces dug into the earth where food could be preserved through the bitter months. It was here, in these makeshift chambers, that the hopes of an entire family were stacked in sacks of grain, bundles of dried herbs, salted meats, and the occasional luxury of cheese hard enough to last until spring. Written accounts from manorial records in England during the 13th century reveal that peasants were acutely aware of the need to store surplus. A portion of their harvest always went to the lord as rent or tithe, but what remained was guarded fiercely. Rye and barley were dried and sealed in wooden bins or clay jars. Meat, especially pork, which could be preserved in astonishing variety, was salted, smoked, or packed in lard. A single pig slaughtered in November could provide a family with sausages, bacon, and fat for cooking well into March, if carefully rationed. But this was not a foolproof system. Grain stores attracted rodents, and infestations could devastate supplies in a matter of weeks. To combat this, peasants sometimes hung sacks from rafters or even sprinkled mint and tansy around cellars, plants believed to repel vermin. Here we glimpse a quirky tidbit. In some regions, families placed carved wooden charms near their granaries, invoking saints or spirits to protect the food from both rats and thieves. Archaeologists have uncovered curious talismans in storage pits, small figurines or crosses, that suggest these rituals were not mere superstition, but practical attempts to guard the village's lifeline. The act of storage carried constant anxiety. Too much damp and mould could set in, too much dryness, and the grain might lose its vitality for planting in the spring. Scholars still debate whether peasants consistently reserved seed grain for the following season, or whether, under famine conditions, desperation forced them to consume it. If the latter, survival one winter could spell disaster the next. We can picture the scene in a typical household in January. A father lowers a torch into the cellar, illuminating rows of cabbages and turnips stored in sand to keep them firm. He measures carefully how much rye to bring up, while his wife decides whether the family can afford a small piece of salted pork for the evening stew. Each decision feels monumental. Misjudge, and hunger might come weeks earlier than expected. Ration too harshly, and children might weaken before spring planting. Yet, there were also communal strategies. Villages often relied on shared granaries, sometimes managed by the church or a local reeve, where reserves were set aside for times of famine. In theory, this system ensured no family starved outright. In practice, favoritism, corruption, or simple shortage meant some villagers fared better than others. Chronicles occasionally note that lords themselves dipped into these communal stocks, leaving peasants with little recourse, but prayer. Stockpiles were more than mere sustenance. They represented hope. They offered peasants the illusion of control in a season that stripped away freedoms. Knowing that somewhere beneath their feet lay jars of beans, strings of onions, or barrels of ale, allowed families to face the long nights with a degree of courage. The cellar was a place of both secrecy and survival, where life hung suspended in the dark, waiting for the thaw. Communal fires, hearths. If the cellar was the storehouse of life, the hearth was its beating heart. In the depths of winter, warmth became as precious as food, and peasants gathered around the fire not only to cook, but to survive. The medieval peasant house was usually a single room, its floor packed earth, its walls plastered wattle and daub. In the centre stood the hearth, little more than a shallow pit lined with stones, where logs or peat smouldered day and night. Smoke curled upwards, sometimes escaping through a small hole in the thatched roof, sometimes lingering so thickly inside that eyes watered and lungs burned. Yet for all its discomforts, this hearth was the lifeline that bound families together against the cold. Records from 12th century France describe entire households sleeping around the fire in shifts, taking turns to stoke embers through the long nights. Firewood was precious, often gathered from communal forests or scavenged from hedgerows. In places where wood was scarce, peat bricks were dried in summer to fuel winter fires, or even dried animal dung was pressed into service. To us, this might sound bleak, but to a medieval family, the glow of even a smoky flame meant survival. The hearth also became a space of ritual. It was said that embers should never be fully extinguished at night, lest evil spirits slip into the home through the ashes. In parts of Germany, families placed iron tools near the hearth to ward off witches said to thrive in the dark of winter. A more curious tidbit comes from Scandinavia, where sagas mention peasants tossing bits of salt or bread into the flames as offerings to house spirits. Whether literal faith or cultural habit, these acts reveal how closely survival was tied to fire and how fragile that flame could seem. Communal fires extended beyond single homes. Villages sometimes maintained larger bonfires during ESP, especially harsh spells, where neighbours would gather not just for warmth but for solidarity. These were moments of both necessity and festivity, blurring the line between survival and celebration. Singing, storytelling, and even rudimentary games helped pass the long nights, transforming shared hardship into something bearable. Scholars still debate whether these communal fires were organised rituals tied to ancient festivals or simply pragmatic responses to bitter cold. Perhaps, as so often in peasant life, they were both. Yet fires were not only about heat, they were about food. Around them hung iron cauldrons, often shared between households, simmering with whatever could be spared: beans, cabbage, a scrap of pork fat, or a handful of grains. These stews, replenished day after day, became both nourishment and symbol. One English chronicler in the 14th century noted that the pot never was empty, yet never full. It was the art of stretching resources to their very limits, ladle by ladle. Imagine, then, a January evening. The wind howls outside the walls, rattling the shutters. Inside, a mother cradles an infant swaddled in rags, rocking close to the fire's edge. A grandfather pokes at the embers, muttering a charm to keep the flame alive. Children doze in a huddle, lulled by the warmth and the soft rhythm of their parents' voices. The smoke may sting their eyes, but without this hearth there would be no tomorrow. The communal fire was more than a tool of survival. It was a gathering place, a source of myth, and a fragile anchor of human connection in a world of ice and hunger. In that circle of warmth, peasants found not only the means to endure winter, but the reason to endure it together. Rags, furs and layers. Long before the idea of central heating, warmth depended on what one could wear. For medieval peasants, winter clothing was not a matter of fashion, but of desperate necessity. The garments that clung to their bodies determined whether they could step into the fields, fetch water from frozen streams, or simply endure the night without succumbing to frost. Yet their wardrobes were humble, built from scraps, patched repeatedly, and rarely washed during the season, for fear of weakening the fabric. Wool was the peasant's closest ally. Homespun and roughly woven, it was not the fine cloth worn by nobles, but thick, coarse stuff that trapped air and retained body heat. Tunics, cloaks, and hose made from wool formed the first line of defence against the cold. Beneath, peasants layered whatever they could manage, linen shirts if they were lucky, or simply additional woolen scraps stitched into makeshift undergarments. The layering principle, something modern hikers would recognise, was already instinctively practised in medieval villages. Furs provided another shield, though not always the luxurious fox or sable of aristocrats. Peasants used rabbit, squirrel, sheepskin, or even dog pelts. Chronicles from 14th century Poland describe peasants sewing together dozens of tiny rodent skins to fashion crude winter cloaks. It sounds eccentric, but survival rarely allowed for pride. In Scandinavia, some families even lined boots with fish skins for insulation, a quirky detail that raises eyebrows today, but speaks volumes about resourcefulness. Footwear was especially precarious. Wooden clogs stuffed with straw or wool were common in wetter regions. where snow turned to slush. In colder climates, leather shoes were lined with rags and bound tightly to keep out draughts. Gloves were a luxury few could afford, so many peasants wrapped their hands in strips of cloth or kept them buried under cloaks. Emerging only to tend the fire or break ice. Clothing also carried symbolic weight. During the harsh winters of the early 14th century, parish records show priests urging wealthier villagers to donate cloaks to their poorer neighbours, sometimes under threat of spiritual censure. Whether these sermons reflected true charity or merely attempts to maintain communal stability is unclear. Scholars still debate whether such acts of redistribution were common practice or rare gestures amplified in church rhetoric. What is certain is that clothing was seen as a communal resource, not simply a personal possession. Even so, warmth was always partial. Draughts crept through homes and dampness ruined fabrics. The smell of smoke clung to every cloak, since peasants often hung garments above the hearth to dry, only to have them coated in soot. Yet this, too, had its benefits. The smoky residue acted as a crude insect repellent, discouraging lice from thriving in the folds. A medieval irony, what stank also protected. Picture a family trudging through snow to fetch water. Their cloaks are patched with visible stitches, sleeves of different colours where new cloth has been added. Children wear garments several sizes too large, hand-me-downs from older siblings. The cold gnaws at their faces, but the layered rags keep them just mobile enough to work. Every garment tells a story of adaptation, thrift, and the unyielding push to survive. Clothing was not comfort. It was endurance stitched together, fur and fabric layered against the endless winter. For the peasant, survival came not in elegance, but in scraps, pieced together to withstand a world that never stopped testing the limits of the human body. Thatched roofs, smoke lofts. If layers of wool and fur shielded the body, the peasant house itself was the final bulwark against the cold. These homes were humble, often a single room where people, animals, and belongings crowded together. Their most distinctive feature was the roof, thatched, thickly bundled with straw or reeds, and designed not only to shed rain, but to trap heat. The winter battle was as much about retaining warmth as creating it, and every detail of construction mattered. Archaeological studies of medieval villages, such as Warren Percy in Yorkshire, show how carefully these houses were arranged. Walls of wattle and daub provided structure, but it was the roof that determined whether a family shivered or slept. A properly thatched roof was nearly a foot thick, packed with layers of straw, angled to carry away water and snow. In winter, this dense cover also acted as insulation, keeping precious warmth from escaping into the night sky. Inside warmth was managed with smoke lofts and low ceilings. Fires were rarely built in open hearths with chimneys. These were luxuries reserved for wealthier homes. Instead, smoke was allowed to gather beneath the thatch, creating a kind of insulating layer. It sounds suffocating, and it was, but this smoky canopy trapped heat closer to the ground, making interiors marginally warmer. The side effect? Villagers lived in air thick with soot. Soot-blackened timbers excavated from medieval cottages still bear witness to generations of this practice. Yet smoke was not merely a nuisance. In a peculiar twist of advantage, it hardened and preserved the thatch, warding off insects and even slowing decay. Some folkloric traditions claimed that a smoky house kept away evil spirits as well as illness. Was this true belief or post hoc justification for necessity? Scholars still debate whether medieval people saw smoke as bless, sing or burden, though their actions suggest they accepted both. These homes were adaptable. In especially cold regions, families lowered ceilings with temporary beams and hung cloths across spaces to keep warmth concentrated near the hearth. Windows were rare, often little more than shutters of wood. Glass was out of reach, but oiled parchment or thin slices of horn sometimes substituted to allow in dim light while blocking draughts. Floors, often simple earth, were layered with rushes or straw that peasants replaced periodically, sometimes sprinkled with herbs like lavender or thyme, which lent a brief fragrance before being trampled into mud. A quirky detail emerges from the records of 15th century Germany. Some families placed warm stones from the hearth beneath their bedding of straw, a crude but effective method of radiant heating. Others even heated bricks and wrapped them in cloth to act as bed warmers, an ancestor of the hot water bottle. These small innovations could mean the difference between waking to numb fingers and toes or not waking at all. Imagine the winter night inside such a home. Smoke curls thickly, stinging the eyes. The roof crackles softly as frost settles on the thatch. A hen clucks sleepily in the corner, pressed against the warmth of a cow. Children breathe in unison on their straw pallets, their faces faintly illuminated by the embers of the hearth. The air is acrid, the floor damp, yet compared to the freezing world outside, the hut feels like a sanctuary. The medieval house was not comfortable by modern standards, but it was astonishingly resilient. With nothing but earth, timber, straw, and ingenuity, peasants created dwellings that endured storm after storm. Every smoky beam and thatched bundle was a testament to a simple truth. Survival required turning the humblest materials into fortresses against the winter's bite. Root crops, famine foods. When the cold tightened its grip and the last daylight faded, food became a daily negotiation. What had been stockpiled in autumn dwindled with every passing week, and families turned to roots and so-called famine foods to keep hunger at bay. These were not delicacies, but hardy staples, turnips, parsnips, onions, and cabbages that endured beneath the soil or stored well in cellars. They lacked the richness of meat or the sweetness of fruit, but their persistence through the season made them invaluable. Medieval cookery manuscripts, such as the Form of Curie compiled for Richard II in the late 14th century, brim with noble recipes, but for peasants, the reality was a single pot of boiled root vegetables. Cabbage was king, cheap, filling, and available in multiple varieties. Turnips and parsnips bulked out stews, while onions flavoured otherwise bland broths. A curious practice appears in northern Europe, where roots were sometimes buried back in heaps of sand during winter, carefully insulated against frost. This way, peasants could dig up fresh produce weeks later, a quiet ingenuity in an otherwise unforgiving world. But when even these ran thin, famine foods emerged. Accounts from the Great Famine of 1315-1317 describe villagers grinding acorns into flour, leaching their bitterness in running water before baking coarse loaves. In Scandinavia, birch bark was peeled, dried, and powdered to stretch bread. Across Europe, weeds such as nettles or goosefoot were boiled into thin soups. To us, such meals sound desperate, and they were. Yet for many, these bitter flavours carried the difference between endurance and collapse. Some practices blur the line between nutrition and ritual. In parts of rural France, peasants baked loaves with a hidden onion or clove of garlic, believing the pungent flavour would drive out the cold. Whether symbolic or simply practical seasoning, the act reveals how even the harshest diets carried traces of hope. Scholars still debate whether famine foods were widely consumed in normal winters or only during crises, but the recurring mentions in chronicles suggest a spectrum, sometimes supplement, sometimes salvation. A quirky tidbit survives in the folklore of Eastern Europe. Children were told that eating turnip soup made bones harder than frost. Whether playful encouragement or genuine belief, it illustrates how deeply food and survival were woven into cultural imagination. Even a bowl of roots could be framed as a kind of magic against the cold. Imagine the peasant table in February. A large pot simmers on the hearth, its broth cloudy with cabbage and onions. A few scraps of salted pork float within, reserved for feast days but added sparingly here for flavour. Beside the pot lies a dark loaf, baked from barley mixed with acorn flour, coarse and dense. Children tear at it hungrily, ignoring its bitterness, while their parents exchange silent glances, calculating how much longer the stores will last. For all their hardships, these diets were balanced in ways we often forget. Root vegetables provided vital vitamins that staved off scurvy, while fermented cabbage, sauerkraut in German regions, offered both nutrition and preservation. Survival was not about abundance, but about adaptation, about knowing what nature would still yield when fields froze and forests fell silent. In every bowl of broth, in every mouthful of bark bread, peasants wrestled with the same question: how long until spring? Ale, broth, and survival drinks. Water in medieval Europe was rarely trusted on its own, especially in winter when streams froze and wells grew stagnant. Instead, peasants relied on a range of warm, sustaining drinks, part nourishment, part comfort, to carry them through the darkest months. Chief among these was ale, brewed weak but steady, a drink that quenched thirst, filled bellies, and provided calories when food was scarce. Ale brewing was a household task as essential as baking bread. Records from 13th century England note women known as alewives, who managed small-scale brewing for both families and neighbours. The ale peasants drank was nothing like modern beer. It was low in alcohol, often consumed the same day it was made, and cloudy with suspended grain. But it was safer than raw water and rich with carbohydrates. In many homes, children drank small ale daily, their mugs filled with a liquid that was closer to thin porridge than intoxicant. Alongside ale, broths simmered constantly over hearth fires. These stews doubled as drink and meal, thin enough to sip, yet hearty enough to nourish. A pot of cabbage broth flavoured with onion, barley, and perhaps a bone for marrow might simmer for days, with ingredients added and subtracted as available. Chroniclers sometimes mocked peasants for their eternal pot, but the system was brilliantly efficient, maximising both heat and sustenance. Yet drinks could also blur into medicine. Hot spice concoctions, often called possets or wassails, blended warm ale or milk with honey, herbs, and sometimes egg. These were thought to chase away chills and fevers alike. A quirky tidbit survives from a 14th century herbal. Peasants were advised to steep rosemary and thyme in warmed ale, then drink it before sleep to safeguard the lungs from the frost. Whether it worked or not, the ritual provided reassurance. Fermentation played a key role beyond ale. In colder regions, peasants brewed weak meads from honey or ciders from windfall apples gathered before snow. These drinks were not luxuries, but vital stores of sugar and energy. In monasteries, the winter refectory rang with the sound of mugs raised to lips, not only monks, but hungry villagers, sometimes admitted for charity. Scholars still debate whether such drinks meaningfully improved nutrition or whether they were simply a safer liquid than water, but their ubiquity suggests a cultural consensus. Warmth and fermentation went hand in hand with survival. There is also the comfort of ritual. Wassailing, particularly in England, involved villagers singing over bowls of spiced ale, offering the first sips to orchards or fields in hopes of a fertile spring. What to modern ears sounds quaint was, in context, a serious act of communal reassurance. In the dead of January, when bellies shrank and tempers grew short, the act of passing a shared mug of steaming drink reinforced bonds as surely as it warmed the body. Picture the hut on a midwinter evening. The fire glows low, and a pot of broth steams faintly. A mother ladles out wooden cups of thin cabbage soup, while the father pours small ale into clay mugs. The children sip, their cheeks flushed from the warmth. Outside, the snow lies heavy and silent, but inside, the ritual of drink binds them to endurance. Ale, broth, spiced concoctions. These were not luxuries, but liquid resilience. In every steaming cup, peasants found not just hydration, but a fleeting sense of warmth, security, and hope against the cold. Animals in the house, when the frost sharpened and the wind howled, peasants turned to an unexpected source of warmth: their animals. In many villages, livestock were not confined to distant barns, but brought directly into the home itself. The peasant dwelling, often one room divided by a low wooden partition, sheltered both people and beasts beneath the same thatched roof. Cows, pigs, sheep and chickens huddled near the hearth or along the walls, their bodies radiating heat that made the difference between tolerable chill and bitter cold. Archaeological digs at Warren Percy in Yorkshire reveal clear traces of this practice. Layers of animal dung intermingled with domestic debris, a reminder that survival required intimacy with livestock. Contemporary chroniclers also mention the mingling of man and beast. A 12th century monk from St Albans noted that peasants in winter lie amidst their beasts, drawing breath as one company. What sounds unsanitary to us was, for them, a pragmatic exchange: warmth and milk for protection and scraps of food. There were practical benefits beyond heat. Chickens laid eggs more regularly when shielded from snow and predators, and cows could be milked without trudging into icy fields. Pigs acted as living stores of meat, fattened indoors until slaughter in late winter. Goats, with their nimbleness and hardiness, were often the first animals peasants relied upon for both warmth and sustenance. A quirky tidbit from Scandinavian folklore even describes goats as winter companions, whose bleats at night were believed to scare away spirits of hunger. This arrangement was far from idyllic. Fleas, lice, and foul smells were constant companions. Straw laid for bedding grew damp and sour, breeding grounds for illness. Smoke from the hearth, mingled with the stench of dung, made interiors harsh on the lungs. Scholars still debate whether such close living genuinely improved survival rates, or whether it exacerbated disease, trading cold for contagion. Evidence of respiratory ailments and parasites in medieval skeletons suggests the cost was high, but the practice endured nonetheless, an indication that warmth outweighed health in the grim arithmetic of survival. Life inside such households blurred the boundaries between species. Children grew up side by side with calves or piglets, playing among animals that might later be slaughtered for food. Some folk customs even acknowledged this closeness. In parts of Central Europe, it was said that speaking kindly to animals on Christmas Eve ensured a good yield in the coming year. Stories circulated of cows kneeling at midnight mass, or pigs grunting omens of fortune. Belief or not, such tales reveal how deeply animals were woven into the winter imagination. Picture the scene on a February night. A cow shifts heavily in the corner, its warm breath clouding in the smoky air. Chickens rustle on a perch above the hearth, while a pig grunts softly from its pen of rough boards. A child stirs in the straw, reaching out to touch the shaggy flank of a sheep. The fire crackles, and though the air is thick with odour, the room is warmer, more alive. In that mingling of species, survival is shared. For the medieval peasant, animals were not just property, but companions in endurance. They warmed, fed, and sheltered families through the deadliest months, a reminder that winter survival was never a human struggle alone. Famine rituals, folk magic. When the cellars thinned and the firewood piles shrank, peasants reached for something beyond the material world. Survival was never only about food and heat, it was also about belief. In the harshest winters, when hunger gnawed and death lingered near, families turned to rituals, charms, and folk magic. These practices, half practical and half symbolic, offered comfort and the illusion of control in a season that otherwise stripped them bare. Accounts from 13th and 14th century Europe are dotted with references to such customs. Villagers carved crosses into loaves of bread before baking, a gesture that sanctified the food and perhaps, in their eyes, multiplied its potency. Some burned herbs like juniper or rosemary in the hearth, believing the smoke would purify the air and ward off illness. In Scandinavia, families scattered grain on their thresholds at midwinter, an offering to unseen spirits in exchange for protection through the frost dot. The church, ever wary of superstition, condemned many of these practices. Yet even priests sometimes tolerated them, recognizing that rituals gave peasants hope. A curious tidbit emerges from German parish records. In particularly hard winters, priests blessed piles of bread with holy water before distributing them, blending Christian liturgy with folk ideas of enchanted food. Scholars still debate whether such rituals were sincere religious syncretism or simply pragmatic ways of keeping communities calm in crisis. Famine also bred omens. Chronicles from the Great Famine of 1315-1317 describe villagers watching the flight of crows or the colour of the moon as signs of whether spring would come early. Some families practiced bread divination, slicing a loaf and reading the cracks as auguries of survival or death. These rituals may strike us as strange, but in a world where weather could not be forecast. Tea and harvests hung on unseen forces, symbols filled the silence. There were darker sides too. In certain regions, when famine pressed hardest, accusations of witchcraft or malice spread. Neighbours suspected of hoarding might be cursed, or women blamed for casting spells that brought blight. Folklore speaks of bread witches who supposedly stole the rising power of dough, leaving loaves flat and families weakened. Whether such figures were scapegoats or echoes of deeper fears, the result was the same. Desperation sought explanations wherever it could. Yet rituals were not only fearful, they could be communal and uplifting. Wassailing, mentioned earlier with drink, also carried magical overtones, as villagers sang and shouted into orchards to awaken the trees for spring. Bonfires were lit at midwinter solstice, their flames said to chase away darkness itself. In Ireland, families hung sprigs of holly or ivy, not only as decoration, but as protection against famine spirits. Imagine a bleak January night. The family gathers at the hearth. Before serving their thin stew, the mother murmurs a blessing over the pot, tracing a sign in the steam. The father casts a pinch of salt into the fire, watching sparks leap like omens. Outside, snow buries the fields, but inside, ritual creates a fragile shield of meaning. These acts did not conjure food from thin air, but they fed something equally vital, the will to endure. By weaving prayers, charms, and small acts of magic into their daily struggle, peasants transformed winter from an enemy into a mystery that could somehow be survived. Bandits, wolves, and fear, as if hunger and cold were not enough. Winter brought other predators. The quiet landscape concealed dangers that stalked both forests and roads, forcing peasants to defend themselves not only from nature's indifference, but from its teeth and from human desperation. The season of snow was also the season of fear. Forests across medieval Europe were home to wolves, whose howls echoed closer to villages when hunger drove them out of the wild. Chronicles from 15th century France recount winters so severe that wolves prowled city streets, emboldened by starvation. For peasants, the threat was constant, livestock dragged from pens, children attacked while gathering wood, travellers vanishing along frozen tracks. To counter this, villagers carried spears or crude clubs, posted night watches, and sometimes organised collective hunts. Yet wolves were also wrapped in myth, creatures of the devil, omens of famine, embodiments of winter itself. A curious tidbit survives from Eastern Europe, where peasants believed wolves could not attack on Christmas Eve, a night of divine truce between beast and man. But predators wore human faces as well. Winter sharpened desperation, and banditry rose with the cold. Records from English manorial courts in the 14th century reveal frequent thefts of firewood, grain, and livestock, often committed by neighbours as much as by wandering rogues. Peasants feared the woods not just for wolves but for outlaw bands, some made of soldiers turned vagrants after wars. A hungry man with a blade was every bit as dangerous as a beast. With fangs, villages responded with vigilance. Some built wooden palisades or gates, crude defences that symbolised solidarity as much as strength. Others relied on the watchful authority of the manor lord, though his protection often came at a price. More taxes, more obligations. Families huddled closer together at night, locking doors not only against the cold, but against intrusion. Scholars still debate whether winter truly increased crime or whether it simply amplified awareness of it, but the fear was real enough to leave its mark in parish records and oral traditions. Fear shaped imagination, too. Tales of werewolves abounded in winter, perhaps born from real wolf encounters mingled with the anxieties of famine. Folklore from the Ardennes region tells of travellers who disappeared on snowy nights, said to have been taken by men cursed to run as beasts. Whether moral warning or storytelling by firelight, these myths remind us that survival was psychological as well as physical. Picture a village in mid-January. Snow lies heavy on the thatch, muffling sound. From the woods beyond the fields comes a long, low howl. Inside, families clutch their children tighter, while a watchman paces the edge of the village, spear in hand, breath clouding in the night air. Every creak of the trees, every crunch of snow carries with it the question, beast, thief, or just the winter wind. For medieval peasants, survival meant vigilance. They endured not only the silence of frozen fields, but the prowling threats that emerged when hunger spread across land and species alike. Winter was not just cold, it was a season that tested courage, sharpened fear, and forced communities to stand together against both man and wolf. Taxes, tithes, and winter lords, even in the depths of winter, when bellies shrank and fires burned low, obligations did not rest. Lords, priests, and kings still demanded their due. For peasants, survival was not only a matter of food and warmth, but of navigating a web of rents, tithes, and taxes that pressed hardest when resources were thinnest. Winter, in many ways, was as much a season of paperwork and power as it was of snow and ice. The medieval manor system bound most peasants to their lords, and payments came in many forms. A portion of grain, livestock, or labour owed at set times of year. In England, for example, Domesday Book records from 1086 already show how precise these obligations could be. So many hens for winter feasts, so much firewood gathered from the forest, so many days of unpaid labour in the Lord's fields. These were not optional. Failure meant fines, punishments, or in the worst cases, eviction. The church added another burden. The tithe, a tenth of one's produce, was technically owed year-round, but in winter, when food ran low, it became especially galling. Parish priests collected grain, cheese, and sometimes even firewood, insisting that to give was to secure heavenly favour. Yet tensions ran deep. A quirky case from 14th century Normandy records villagers hiding their best cheese in haylofts while presenting mouldy scraps to the priest. It was an act of quiet rebellion, one that reveals how strained these obligations felt in the hungry season. But winter was also the season of hospitality, at least in theory. Lords staged grand feasts, drawing on the dues extracted from their tenants, while peasants glimpsed abundance from afar. At Christmas, some were invited into manor halls for token generosity, perhaps a loaf of white bread or a cup of spiced ale. These gestures reinforced hierarchy, charity as spectacle, survival as privilege granted by two. He powerful, scholars still debate whether such events genuinely eased peasant suffering, or whether they served more as ritualized displays of control. For the poorest, obligations could be fatal. A family that barely scraped by might surrender its last sack of grain in January, leaving little for February. Others mortgaged future labour, binding themselves more tightly to their lord in exchange for emergency aid. The cycle of debt deepened with each hard season, ensuring that winter was not just a natural hardship, but a political one. Imagine the moment. A reeve arrives at a peasant's door, tally stick in hand. Snow clings to his boots as he counts sacks of barley, noting what must be delivered to the manor barn. The family stands silent, children watching with wide eyes as their stores diminish. Outside, the fields lie frozen and barren. Inside, the realization grows that what remains must stretch thinner still. Taxes and tithes did more than empty larders. They shaped how peasants viewed authority. Lords were protectors, yes, but also predators of another kind. Priests offered salvation, yet often at the cost of immediate hunger. Survival, then, was never simply a battle against weather. It was a negotiation with power, a constant balancing act between obedience and quiet resistance. For peasants, winter was not just cold and hungry, it was also a season when obligations weighed heaviest, when every coin, every egg, every sheaf surrendered to authority might spell the difference between survival and despair. Festivals in the frost, amid the bleakness of winter, there were moments when the cold was briefly forgotten. Festivals, holy days, feast days and seasonal rituals punctuated the long season with colour, light and community. For medieval peasants, these gatherings were not frivolous luxuries, but vital intervals of relief, where food was shared, songs were sung, and life felt larger than survival. Christmas stood at the heart of the season. Accounts from 12th century England describe villagers gathering in parish churches where candles burned brightly against the dark. After Mass, festivities spilled into homes and manor halls. Even the poorest families tried to set aside something special, perhaps a little honey in the ale, or a rare bit of meat saved from slaughter. Lords often staged feasts, partly as obligation, partly as display. In France, it was customary for tenants to bring small gifts to their lord at Christmastide, eggs, bread or firewood, in return for scraps from the manor's own abundance. It was a ritual that blended devotion, duty and reward. Yet winter celebrations were not limited to the church. The turning of the year carried echoes of older, pre-Christian traditions. In northern Europe, Yule logs were burned to drive away darkness, their embers thought to protect homes for months after. In some villages, young men disguised themselves in animal hides or straw costumes, parading through streets in a raucous inversion of order. A quirky tidbit survives in the straw bear of German folklore, where a man dressed head to toe in straw danced through villages at midwinter, collecting offerings of food and drink. Scholars still debate whether such customs were remnants of pagan rites or creative inventions of the medieval period, but their endurance suggests they mattered deeply. As winter dragged on, Carnival arrived before Lent. This was the season's last great indulgence, a feast of meat, ale, and merriment before the austerity of fasting. In some towns, peasants mocked their betters in parades, electing fool kings or staging comic plays. The festival inverted hierarchy, if only for a day. Hunger could be momentarily forgotten in laughter, song, and the simple joy of abundance, however fleeting. Music and storytelling were central to these occasions. Around fires or in taverns, minstrels recited ballads, and villagers shared tales both sacred and strange. These stories reminded listeners that hardship was not eternal, that spring would come, and that survival itself was worthy of celebration. Food, laughter, and song were not luxuries but strategies, fortifying the spirit as surely as stew fortified the body. Picture the scene. A snowbound village on Christmas Eve. Lanterns glow in frosted windows. Inside the parish, voices rise in hymns, their echoes mingling with the crackle of candles. Later, in a peasant hut, neighbours crowd together, sharing bread dipped in broth, passing a jug of spiced ale. Children laugh, their cheeks flushed, while outside the wind howls unnoticed. For one night, fear loosens its grip. Festivals were not escapes from reality, but respites within it. They gave peasants permission to feast, to hope, and to remember that life was not only toil and hunger. In the frost of winter, these gatherings were sparks of warmth, binding communities together until the thaw returned. Children in the cold, among all who endured the medieval winter, children bore the harshest weight. Their bodies were smaller, their reserves thinner, their resilience tested by hunger and frost in ways that adults could at least understand. For peasant families, every winter was a gamble with their youngest lives, a season when mortality pressed hardest. Records from manorial rolls and parish registers paint a grim picture. Child mortality in medieval Europe was staggeringly high, and winter sharpened that risk. Infants were especially vulnerable. Without steady milk, whether from their mothers or a goat, the cold months meant dwindling nutrition. Even older children, who shared in broths and breads, often received the smallest portions. Parents rationed ruthlessly, sometimes leaving themselves hungry to give a child a better chance, sometimes forced into the opposite calculation, preserving adult strength for labour come spring. Clothing for children was minimal, often hand-me-downs from siblings or patched rags sewn smaller. A quirky detail emerges from 15th century England. Babies were tightly swaddled not just for comfort, but in the belief that restricting movement kept them warm and helped limbs grow straight. These swaddling bands, layered with scraps of wool, became miniature survival suits. Older children wore cloaks several sizes too large, sleeves dragging in the snow, garments meant to last years rather than months. Illness compounded the hardship. Cold air, smoky huts, and damp floors bred coughs and fevers. Medieval physicians warned against winter phlegm, a vague but dreaded condition thought to settle in children's chests. Remedies ranged from honey mixed with warm ale to charms hung around the neck. Scholars still debate whether these treatments offered any real relief or were simply gestures of hope, but families clung to them nonetheless. Yet chill. Dren were not merely passive sufferers, they were participants in survival. Even at 5 or 6, they fetched water, gathered kindling, or helped mind animals within the home. Some were sent to glean leftover grain or forage for edible roots. In this way, childhood was brief, blurred into labour as soon as small bodies could contribute. And still, there was play. Accounts from medieval Germany describe children sledding on frozen slopes with wooden boards, or chasing each other across snowfields. Even in famine years, laughter punctuated the silence, as if resilience itself was a game. Folklore often centred on children in winter. In Slavic tales, the figure of Morosko, the frost spirit, tested children's endurance, rewarding the obedient and punishing the weak. In Western Europe, stories of Christkindl or St. Nicholas visiting children at midwinter reflected both religious hope and the reality that gifts, even as simple as a piece of bread, could feel miraculous. Such stories were more than diversions. They were tools for survival, teaching children to endure, to hope, to obey, to find meaning in hardship. Picture a night in February. In a smoky hut, 3 children huddle together beneath a patched cloak, their breath visible in the dim glow of embers. The youngest stirs fitfully, coughing. The mother murmurs a prayer while tucking straw tighter around the pallet. Outside, snow buries the fields. Inside, the fragile boundary between warmth and cold, life and loss, narrows by the hour. For peasants, children embodied both vulnerability and future. Each winter was a reckoning, a reminder that survival was not guaranteed but fought for, layer by layer, meal by meal, prayer by prayer. Survivors' ingenuity. Winter pressed peasants into corners, and from those corners came creativity. Ingenuity was not an abstract virtue but a daily necessity, shaping how families adapted to dwindling stores, failing tools, and the relentless bite of frost. Every trick, every scrap, every moment of invention was a victory carved out against the season's indifference. Craftwork filled the long, dark months. With fields frozen, peasants turned to repairing tools, weaving baskets, carving wooden spoons, or spinning wool into yarn. Archaeological finds from deserted villages like Warren Percy reveal countless bone needles, spindle whorls, and half-finished wooden objects, evidence of winter labour as much as summer ploughing. These tasks were survival disguised as craft. A new spindle might mean more yarn, more cloth, more warmth. A mended hoe promised readiness for spring. Food ingenuity took many forms. Leftover scraps of fat were rendered into tallow, used for candles that stretched precious hours of light. Bones were boiled until they softened, marrow scraped out for sustenance. A quirky practice in parts of Scandinavia involved pressing blood from slaughtered animals into cakes, dried and stored as emergency rations. To modern tastes it sounds grim, yet such resourcefulness turned waste into life. Not all ingenuity was material. Villages organised systems of mutual aid, lending tools or sharing firewood with those in crisis. Oral traditions preserved clever tricks, laying straw across icy paths to prevent injury, or spreading ashes on snow to melt walkways faster. Scholars still debate whether such practices were widespread communal norms or isolated flashes of generosity, but they underscore a central truth. Survival was rarely solitary. Peasants also scavenged. Winter winds tore branches from trees, and these were quickly gathered for fuel. Streams yielded reeds, fuss, or weaving mats, and forests offered resin-rich pine as makeshift torches. Even the landscape of scarcity provided, if one knew where to look. Children and elders alike joined in this scavenging, their labour woven into the family's fragile endurance. Ingenuity touched the realm of faith and ritual too. When food was scarce, villagers stretched feasts with clever substitutions. Bread for holy days might be made from oats or chestnuts instead of wheat. Candle processions were sometimes lit with rushlights, reeds dipped in animal fat rather than wax. These adjustments preserved tradition even when materials faltered, a cultural resilience that paralleled physical survival. Picture a hut in mid-January. By the hearth, a woman spins wool by lamplight, her spindle twisting rhythmically while a child plats rushes into mats. A man carves a wooden ladle from a fallen branch, its surface rough but serviceable. In the corner, a clay pot simmers with broth, thickened not by meat, but by cleverly foraged roots. The air smells of smoke, resin, and tallow. Every gesture speaks of invention under pressure. Ingenuity did not erase hardship. It softened it, stretched it, made it survivable. Each patched cloak, each recycled scrap of food, each improvised candle kept darkness and hunger at bay for one more night. The peasant's greatest tool, beyond root or fire, was their capacity to transform scarcity into endurance. Echoes of endurance. By the time the first green shoots pierced the thawing soil, medieval peasants had already endured months of hunger, cold, and uncertainty. Winter was never conquered. It was survived, night by night, fire by fire, meal by meal. And yet, from these hardships emerged traditions, practices, and beliefs whose echoes linger even in our own age. The rhythm of survival shaped culture as much as agriculture. Festivals like Christmas and Carnival, rooted in cycles of scarcity and relief, remain embedded in our calendars. The communal hearth evolved into the modern fireplace, its symbolic role of gathering still intact. Even our comfort foods, stews, breads and broths, trace their lineage to the humble peasant pot simmering endlessly through the frost. A quirky echo survives in Scandinavian cuisine, where bark bread, once a desperate famine food, has been revived as a curiosity in artisanal bakeries. What was necessity becomes heritage, repurposed in gentler times. But the winter struggle was not only about food or warmth, it forged resilience and solidarity. Villages that gathered around fires, shared ale, or told stories to children were enacting survival as community. Scholars still debate whether this resilience was born of necessity or choice, whether peasants leaned into each other by will or simply because there was no alternative. Perhaps both are true. What is certain is that without cooperation, the isolated family rarely thrived. The memory of hardship seeped into stories and folklore. Wolves became villains, witches were blamed for famine, saints were invoked for protection. These tales, passed down in smoky huts, still haunt our fairy tales and bedtime stories. The shadow of the medieval winter lingers in the figure of the hungry beast, the enchanted loaf, the magical fire that keeps darkness away. And yet endurance was not purely grim. In Lao, at carnival, in songs sung during wassailing, in the rough joy of children sledding on boards, peasants carved out moments of life beyond survival. Their ingenuity turned scarcity into resilience. Their rituals turned fear into meaning. Their communities turned cold into connection. These were the quiet victories that kept humanity alive through centuries of brutal winters. Picture the thaw. Fields softening, streams rushing with melted snow, the first lambs bleating in the meadows. Families, thin but alive, step into the sunlight with tools repaired, seeds preserved and stories renewed. Another winter survived, another thread woven into the long fabric of history. We remember medieval peasants often as shadows beneath lords and castles, yet in their endurance we glimpse something universal, the fragile, stubborn will to live. Their winters were harsher than ours, their tools fewer, their world narrower, but their solutions, their rituals, their endurance still resonate. In every warm hearth, in every winter feast, in every story told by firelight, echoes of their struggle linger. The shocking ways they survived remind us not only of their hardship, but of their humanity. A humanity that endured, adapted, and carried the memory of winter into the spring of generations. Conclusion. The story of how medieval peasants endured winter is not one of triumph over nature, but of coexistence with its cruelty. Through cellars stocked with roots, fires that smoked as much as they warmed, and rituals that blended faith with fear, they wove survival from scarcity. Animals slept beside them, festivals gave respite, and ingenuity turned waste into sustenance. Each season tested them, yet each spring proved that endurance was possible. These lives, often overlooked in history's grand chronicles, hold lessons for us still. Their hardships remind us of the fragility of human existence, but their resilience speaks to the power of adaptation and community. To survive winter was to reaffirm life, even in its most meagre forms. And in their small victories, shared meals, songs by firelight, the first thawing field, we glimpse the enduring strength of the human spirit.